The ocean has swallowed countless secrets, but none more haunting than what happened aboard a small British ship in 1789. A crew divided, a captain humiliated, and a young officer pushed so far that he crossed a line no one could ever uncross. Most people think they know the mutiny on the Bounty. Hollywood has spent nearly a century turning it into a tale of a tyrant captain and a heroic rebel. But what if the real story isn't that simple? What if the truth is darker, more human, and far more disturbing than any film ever dared to show? Because the moment Fletcher Christian walked onto that deck with a cutlass in his hand, fate shifted, loyalty shattered, and the British Empire suddenly had a ghost ship roaming the Pacific. But how did it come to this? And why did a crew that had once trusted their commander suddenly snap? Before we dive deeper, do me a favor. If you're someone who loves history that doesn't sugarcoat the past, hit that like button and subscribe to the History Sage. It helps more than you know, and I promise. The truth behind what really happened on the Bounty will stay with you long after this video ends. Now let's go back to where this tragedy truly began. Bounty wasn't built for glory, it wasn't built for war, it wasn't even built for exploration. It was built for a mission tied directly to the Caribbean slave economy, a detail movies conveniently forgot. The British government wanted cheap food for enslaved laborers, and breadfruit seemed like the perfect answer. Tahiti had plenty of it, so they bought a small merchant ship, renamed it Bounty, and handed it to a 33-year-old lieutenant named William Bligh. Bligh wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a diplomat either. And on board his tiny ship, stuffed with men, cramped quarters, and an obsessive mission, every word he spoke carried weight. Weight that sometimes crushed the wrong people, including one man in particular, a young ambitious officer named Fletcher Christian, a man Bligh trusted enough to promote before their friendship began to fracture in ways neither could control. But what exactly pushed these two men from friendship to fury? That part of the story begins long before the first shout of mutiny, and it starts on the open ocean. With the Bounty sailing toward a disaster no one saw coming, the Bounty's journey was supposed to be straightforward: sail to Tahiti, load breadfruit plants, return to the Caribbean, simple, clean, controlled. But nothing about this voyage stayed controlled for long. Bligh planned to take the ship around the lethal waters of Cape Horn. That was mistake number one. Storm after storm hammered the tiny vessel. Waves smashed over the deck. And for 30 brutal days, the Bounty fought winds so fierce they made progress impossible. Men whispered, tempers formed cracks. And the first seeds of resentment took root. Finally, Bligh had to admit defeat. He turned the ship around, choosing the longer route, a decision that added months to the already exhausting journey. Months trapped together. Months of watching Bligh push harder, demand more, and lose patience with the very men who needed him to hold his ground. But when the Bounty finally sailed into Matavai Bay, Tahiti, everything changed. This was mistake number two. Tahiti wasn't just an island. It was paradise. Warm winds. Abundant food. A culture that embraced pleasure instead of punishing it. After months of suffering, the crew felt like they'd stepped into a dream that would make the discipline of naval life feel unbearable. Many of the men formed relationships with Tahitian women. Some fell in love. Others simply tasted freedom for the first time in their lives.
Ow.
And among them was Fletcher Christian. Christian didn't just enjoy Tahiti, he thrived there. He found friendship, affection, and a sense of belonging he had never known back in England. Every day he spent on the island made returning to a rigid wooden ship under Bligh's command feel like a punishment. Meanwhile, Bligh focused entirely on the mission. He built a shore camp. He oversaw the care of 1,015 breadfruit plants, pushed the crew to work with precision and speed. And as the months rolled on, something shifted between him and Christian. Something subtle, but dangerous. Christian felt Bligh watching him, judging him. And Bligh, stressed, undermined, and desperate to maintain control, began to snap more often. His tone grew sharper, his accusations harsher. And every time he lashed out, the crew watched their once stable officers drift further and further apart. Then came the moment that would tip everything. A simple accusation, a public insult, humiliation so deep that it shattered the last piece of trust Christian had left. And from that moment on, the mutiny became inevitable. By the time the Bounty pulled away from Tahiti in April 1789, the ship was heavier, tighter, and more suffocating than ever. The 1,015 breadfruit plants filled precious space. Supplies were squeezed into corners. The men torn away from the paradise they had grown attached to felt trapped again inside a floating prison. And William Bligh felt the pressure more than anyone. Every wilted leaf, every missing tool, every delay. It all triggered something in him, a sharpness, a paranoia. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he was spiraling, and the crew could feel it. Then came the coconuts. One morning, Bligh discovered several coconuts missing from the ship's storage. It wasn't a major loss, but in Bligh's mind, it was a betrayal, a sign that discipline was slipping, that someone was undermining him, that the entire mission was at risk. He marched onto the deck and confronted his officers in front of the entire crew. And Fletcher Christian, unfortunately, was the closest target. "My God, sir, have you stolen my coconuts?" Bligh demanded. Christian froze. The crew stared. And Bligh didn't stop there. He insulted Christian's honor, his integrity, his loyalty, in front of everyone. For a gentleman officer in the 18th century, public humiliation was worse than punishment. It was a wound to the soul. Christian said nothing, but something inside him cracked. In that moment, the friendship he once shared with Bligh died instantly. Bligh walked away, believing he had restored discipline. He had done the opposite. That night, Christian sat alone, staring into the black waves below. He considered building a raft, considered paddling away into open ocean, a desperate plan, but one that showed just how broken he had become. But as the hours passed, despair hardened into decision. Christian would not run. He would take the ship. And as dawn approached on April 28, 1789, he quietly gathered a small group of men, some loyal to him, some simply desperate to return to Tahiti, others with their own grudges against Bligh. They moved across the deck like shadows, silent, focused, determined. And as they dragged him from his cabin, the captain who had once stood proudly beside James Cook now found himself helpless, a prisoner on his own. Fletcher Christian stood on deck, breathing hard, gripping a cutlass he wished he had never needed. Below him, William Bligh, furious, disbelieving, humiliated, was dragged up by sailors who had once pledged to obey him. "Mr. Christian, I'll have you answer for this," Bligh warned. But Christian didn't answer. He couldn't. He was already slipping into a place between purpose and regret. Some mutineers were bold, some were nervous. And some, staring at Bligh's bound hands, suddenly realized the cost of what they had just done. Still, it was too late to turn back. Bligh and 18 loyal men were forced into the Bounty's 23-foot open launch, a tiny boat meant for short trips. Not survival. The mutineers gave them a compass, some food, and a few tools. No weapons, no charts, no mercy. Christian looked away as they pushed the launch from the ship's side. Some said he was crying, others swore his face was stone. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. He knew he had destroyed his life. The small boat drifted away, swallowed by the vast Pacific. And Bligh, incredibly, did not despair. He stood, steadied himself, and declared, "I will take us home." The men stared at him. They were exhausted, terrified, and thousands of miles from safety. But Bligh was not merely a commander, he was a master navigator, trained under the legendary Captain James Cook. And now, trapped in a tiny boat with barely enough food for a week, he would attempt a journey almost no one believed was possible. First, he attempted to land at Tofua to gather supplies. A hostile crowd appeared almost immediately. Stones flew, spears followed. Quartermaster John Norton was killed, the only casualty of the entire voyage. Bligh had the others jump into the boat and escape. From that moment on, he vowed to avoid all islands, no matter how hungry they became, no matter how desperate the crew felt. He pointed the boat west, thousands of miles toward the Dutch settlement at Timor. And then began one of the most astonishing survival journeys in maritime history. But while Bligh battled storms, starvation, and grief, Fletcher Christian faced a different kind of nightmare. A nightmare that began the moment the Bounty disappeared over the horizon. As Bligh's tiny launch battled its way across the open ocean, the Bounty sailed in the opposite direction, toward a future the mutineers believed would be easier, safer, even free. But freedom has a way of showing its teeth. Fletcher Christian guided the ship back toward Tahiti, the only place that felt familiar, the only place that felt like hope. Some mutineers cheered, some relaxed, but others, began asking questions Christian couldn't answer. What happens when the Navy comes? What if they hang us? What if Bligh survives? Every question chipped at Christian's confidence. When the Bounty finally reached Tahiti in June 1789, the islanders welcomed them back warmly. 16 mutineers chose to remain there. Many had wives, friends, and lives they wanted to reclaim. They convinced themselves the British Navy would never find them. Or if it did, maybe the islanders would protect them. They were tragically wrong, but Christian knew Tahiti was a trap he couldn't escape. If Bligh lived, and he feared that more than anything, the Navy would come. And he, the leader of the mutiny, would be the first man hanged. So he made a new plan. A desperate one. Christian gathered a small group of loyal men, 8 mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, and 12 Tahitian women, and fled the island, beginning a search for a safe haven across the vast Pacific. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Supplies dwindled. Hope wavered. And then they found it. A tiny speck in the ocean, Pitcairn Island. A place so remote, so isolated that even the best charts mislocated it. If the British Navy searched for them, it would look miles away from where the island truly sat. It was a perfect hiding place. They burned the Bounty to the waterline to erase all trace of their location. A fiery sky marking the point of no return. When the flames faded, they believed they had won their freedom. They hadn't. Life on Pitcairn fractured almost immediately. Jealousies, rivalries, cultural clashes, arguments over the women they had brought, over who was leader, over who controlled the few supplies they had. Friendships dissolved, power shifted violently, and the isolated paradise turned into a powder keg. One by one, the mutineers began to die in fights, in drunken rages, in disputes fueled by resentment and desperation. By 1800, only one of them was left alive, John Adams, surrounded by the women and children who looked to him for survival. Christian had vanished long before, his exact fate still a mystery. But while Pitcairn spiraled into bloodshed and despair, Bligh was fighting a different battle. One that would push him to the edge of human endurance. While chaos consumed the mutineers on Pitcairn, William Bligh was carving his name into naval history, not with a sword, but with sheer willpower. The launch was barely big enough to hold everyone. The sides sat low in the water. Every wave felt like it could swallow them whole, and their rations. 1 ounce of bread, a quarter pint of water, per man, per day. Yet Bligh refused to let despair take root. He kept meticulous logs, charted every mile, and inspired his men with a calm that bordered on unbelievable. They weren't just surviving, they were navigating. Storms slammed the boat until it nearly split apart. Salt water burned their skin, their lips cracked, their clothes rotted on their backs. But Bligh never stopped steering west. He avoided islands. He knew one wrong landing meant death. He kept the men rowing until their hands bled. He rationed food until their stomachs ached violently. And he stood in the stern every night, scanning the horizon, guiding his men with the same precision he once showed under Captain Cook. Then came Tofua. Their only attempt to land for supplies, the islanders attacked immediately. Stones flew like bullets. Spears rained down. Quartermaster John Norton died buying the others time to escape. It was the only death of the entire voyage, a sacrifice Bligh never forgot. From that point on, the boat became their entire world. They endured 47 days of torment, 47 days of hunger, 47 days of storms so violent the boat nearly capsized again and again. But through all of it, Bligh's navigation was flawless. On June 14, 1789, after traveling more than 3,600 nautical miles, the launch finally reached the Dutch settlement at Kupang. The men collapsed on the shore, barely alive, barely able to stand, but safe. It remains one of the greatest survival journeys in maritime history. A journey that forced even Bligh's harshest critics to admit one thing. Whatever his flaws, the man was a brilliant seaman. But while Bligh slowly made his way back to England, the British Navy had already begun hunting the mutineers. And when the HMS Pandora arrived in Tahiti, the real consequences of the mutiny began. When Bligh finally returned to England, exhausted but alive, he walked straight into the storm he had been dreading. A mandatory court-martial awaited him, the price for losing a Royal Navy ship. Stood before the Admiralty, not as a mutineer, but as a commander who had been overthrown by his own men. Witnesses spoke. Logs were reviewed. Bligh delivered his testimony with precision and restraint. And in the end, the court ruled clearly. He had done everything possible to prevent the mutiny. The blame did not fall on him. He was acquitted. But the mutineers who stayed on Tahiti, their fate was far darker. The Pandora arrives, and karma hits hard in 1790. HMS Pandora, under Captain Edward Edwards, was sent to hunt down the rebels. When it reached Tahiti in March 1791, 14 mutineers were arrested immediately. The crew built a small wooden cell on deck and locked the prisoners inside. They called it Pandora's Box, a grim name. It's an even grimmer reality. The ship then searched the Pacific for Fletcher Christian, but found nothing. No sign of the bounty. No clue of Pitcairn Island. And no hint of whether Christian was even still alive. Then fate struck again. On the return journey, Pandora wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef. 4 of the imprisoned mutineers drowned inside Pandora's box. The survivors clung to debris and drifted until rescue. When the remaining 10 finally reached England, their trials shook the nation. 3 were hanged. Others were pardoned. Some had their sentences reduced. But Fletcher Christian, the man at the center of it all, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into history. Pitcairn, a paradise turned prison on Pitcairn Island. The mutineers who fled with Christian had descended into chaos almost. Immediately, jealousy, violence, revenge, and the weight of knowing they had no escape. By 1800, only 1 mutineer remained alive, John Adams, surrounded by women and children who still carried the trauma of those early violent years. When an American ship accidentally discovered the settlement in 1808, the world finally learned what had become of the bounty, and by then, Britain didn't care anymore. Too much time had passed, too much blood had already been spilled. Pitcairn was allowed to remain a colony. To this day, many of its residents are direct descendants of the mutineers and their Tahitian companions. And what of Bligh? Despite everything, Bligh's career soared. He commanded ships in major battles. Admiral Nelson praised him. He completed a second breadfruit mission successfully. And in 1805, he became governor of New South Wales, where he would face another mutiny, the infamous Rum Rebellion. But that is a story for another video on the History Sage. The twist, what really happened. Hollywood loves its villains and heroes, but real history rarely fits into such clean boxes. William Bligh wasn't a tyrant. Fletcher Christian wasn't a saint. They were 2 men under pressure, crushed by isolation, fear, and months of survival in a world that allowed no weakness. The mutiny wasn't a rebellion against cruelty. It was a collision of personalities. A cultural shock after Tahiti's freedom. A moment of humiliation too deep to forgive. And the brutal reminder that a wooden ship on a vast ocean can turn even the strongest men into strangers. Final words, the mutiny on the Bounty wasn't just a story of rebellion. It was a story of being human, of breaking, bending, surviving, and sometimes losing ourselves along the way. If you want more true stories told without the Hollywood filter, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and stay with the History Sage. Because the ocean still holds 1,000 secrets. And we're just getting started.